very much. I really enjoyed talking about this and look forward to the questions and the panel discussion later. Thank you.
Thanks, Christoph, for your interesting talk. And I think every page contains a $1 million question. This is a very interesting presentation. I think we have, we may not have time, but let's see if we have time for one question from the audience.
Otherwise, I'll also be around in the break, so we can certainly have discussions there. I'm very happy to follow up, also offline, of course, with people. But I appreciate the interest in the talk and the feedback, of course. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thank you very much, Christoph. I think we can continue to our next speech from Rishabh from Spotify, and he will give a live presentation. Rishabh,
yeah. Okay, perfect. I'm assuming you can see the screen.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And my audio is okay?
Yes, sounds great.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be part of this workshop. I love this workshop topic, right? Industry recommender systems. And I'm going to just piggyback on the Netflix talk. And I think like we were just talking about like trade-offs. And in here, what we are going to do is like exactly go dive deeper into this trade-off world and really talk about like how do we deal with these trade-offs across multiple stakeholders. So in this talk, I think I'm going to spend like 35 minutes and hopefully like the last 5 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to kind of use the chat window to type in your questions, which I can look at and answer later. So here we're going to talk about like multi-stakeholder recommendations and really going beyond just consumers. So when we're developing recommender systems, then what all are the stakeholders should we be kind of considering, and how do we design these algorithms to support all these stakeholders? So in a sense, like I'm going to split this talk into 3 to 4 parts. In the first part, I'm just going to give a brief background on what are multi-stakeholder platforms and what kind of motivations do they give us for designing these systems. In the second part, I'm going to talk about like 2 different series of work we have done. One is like how do we actually deal with these trade-offs with the user objectives, with the supplier objectives, and the platform goals. I'm going to talk about a couple of papers there. Then really kind of go broad and say that, okay, when we are designing these systems, then how can we identify these opportunities wherein we can support some of these suppliers, support some of these platform goals. And I'm going to give like, not go into detail, but like just briefly talk about in the high level, a few works we have over there. And towards the end, I really would want to just kind of open it up for a few broader questions, like some open questions which like we are really interested in. And I hope the audience in this workshop are kind of interested in some of these broader questions. Great. So when you talk about multi-stakeholder platforms, then like what have we been doing as a community so far? We've been looking at traditional recommender systems, which are entirely user-centric. So by user-centric, we mean that we care about user satisfaction. We have these user interfaces. We look at like user interactions. We look at these metrics, which are user-centric. We decide on deploying a new model if it makes users happy, which is great. And it has kind of resulted in a lot of users using these recommender systems now. But essentially, the question which we want to kind of bring attention to is that, is caring about the user enough? And if you look at a bunch of these companies here, including Netflix, which the previous talk was amazingly covering well on how do they kind of think about trade-offs here. So a lot of these companies are essentially multi-stakeholder platforms. So we have the user, but we also have the artist for Spotify. We have the Uber drivers for Uber. We have the Airbnb host and guest. We also have like the delivery partners for Postmates or Uber Eats. We have the platform itself. So I think like one of the changes which I want to bring attention to is that when we look at these platforms, let's not look at them only from a user-centric perspective. The goal of these systems is to kind of care about a bunch of these stakeholders so as to develop this healthy and sustainable platform. Because only if you only care about like one set of stakeholders, then you may not have that sustainable relationship on your platform, which could kind of ensure this long-term health of your platform. Just a quick example, like if you look at Uber, right? So if there are no drivers, then as a user, the platform is almost useless to me. So again, same vice versa. Like if there are a lot of drivers on Uber, but there are no users to kind of actually request a ride, then again, like it's really bad for the platform. So again, like when we think about recommendation strategy, then up until now, we were saying that let's kind of develop a model which maximizes some of your objectives, which are user-centric. Now, I think the pitch is let's go from a single objective world to a multiple objective world. And here, the suppliers are giving us some objectives. The platform economics is giving us certain objectives along with the user-centric objectives. So let's look at a few case studies in a short period of time and just motivate this work in a bit further. So when you look at Uber Eats, then Uber Eats is a three-sided platform. Like we have the eaters, we have the restaurant partners, we have the delivery partners. And such a system can optimize for a multiple objectives. I'm not saying that all of these should go in all at once, but then like you have to have some consideration when you're designing your recommender systems. So again, there's a nice link at the bottom, which is really Uber Eats people giving a good job at going like talking about their journey and how they've evolved their systems. But here, if you look at like a few of these objectives, so it talks about exposure of restaurants and earnings per delivery partners, which kind of start to give us a feeling that, hey, when we are deciding what kind of restaurants to show on Uber Eats, then maybe we should look at some of these objectives from different stakeholders. Let's look at Etsy. So Etsy is again a marketplace for craftsmen, and some of this also applies very nicely to Amazon and other e-commerce platforms. So here we also have buyers, sellers, and platform, and again it's a three-sided market, and a bunch of different objectives across different stakeholders are kind of interesting for us. And going beyond, like if you look at Airbnb, again, it's a two-sided marketplace. We have hosts and guests, and like we should kind of care about both of these stakeholders. And same for, if you look at some of these Airbnb objectives, then when you're looking at bookings, then really, there are few hosts which are really popular and great, but then as a platform, we might want to care about some of these tail hosts, like tail in terms of their popularity perhaps. So again, like this could be one objective. We could also want to help hosts who host less often. So these are all like, again, some motivations on why and how systems like these have been thinking about these multi-stakeholder problems. And for us at Spotify, we kind of view ourselves as the platform which connects the artists and fans. And increasingly, the artists could be the music creators and also like the podcast creators. So how do we kind of form this ecosystem wherein the artist and fans can connect in a meaningful way? So this is like the brief motivation. And if you're with me so far, then hopefully this is motivation enough that, hey, it's not just about users. It's not just about developing a model which maximizes user satisfaction. And we should look at some of these other stakeholders and define their objectives and come and kind of trade these off together. So in the next 5 to 7 minutes, I'm going to talk about what kind of trade-offs exist and how can we develop some of these, a multi-objective model for kind of surfacing these recommendations. So if you look at the trade-offs across consumers and suppliers, so we had this paper at CIKM back in 2018, wherein we are looking at just two stakeholders, like baby steps. We start small, we say that, okay, I care about my user, so relevance is an objective from the user perspective, and exposure diversity is an objective from my artist perspective. So exposure diversity could be a proxy for fairness, and I want to be fair across suppliers, or just like, it could be one of your, any favorite objective you want for your suppliers, essentially. So when we start looking at it, then let's say we look at this plot. So on the x-axis, we have the supplier exposure, that how many suppliers are actually getting exposed. On the y-axis, we have relevance to the user. So interestingly, like there's nothing on the top right. So top right is amazing. Why? Why? Because content at the top right means that it is relevant for the users, highly relevant, so high on the y-axis, and it is great on supplier exposure. It's like great for the supply fairness. So it's like high on the x-axis. So there is a void over there. That means we don't have much content which would tick mark both of these goals which we have. So again, this kind of motivates us to think about these trade-offs. That, okay, if I have to care about both of these, then I'll have to model it accordingly. I will not get these for free, essentially. So in this paper, we looked at a few of these trade-off policies. So in the first couple of policies, we can say that I don't care about the other goal. I'll just either optimize for relevance or optimize for supplier exposure. You could do some really trivial like trade-off policies, like a weighted sum. That, hey, I have a bandit setting, but my policy is really some combination of my two objectives. You can treat it as another form of like optimization, constraint optimization. You can say, I want to maximize my fairness, but I want to give a minimum guarantee that the product manager would be really okay because I ensure that I'm not going to tank relevance beyond this. So I give some guarantees on relevance, and then maybe let me do whatever I can for the other objectives. Or you can have some of these adaptive policies which are user adaptive. Again, the details are in the paper, but globally, I think like the point I'm trying to convey over here is that when you have just two objectives, then you start thinking about how do we trade off across these two objectives. And interestingly, in the results, we saw that there's a very nice interpolation point. So again, like on the x-axis, we vary the importance we give. So on the total right, it's relevance. On the total left, it's fairness to the suppliers. And on the y-axis, we have user satisfaction. So interestingly, if you look at these red circle, then there are these inflection points. And these inflection points are kind of points of good trade-off. That we won't tank satisfaction by a lot, but still we'll get a lot of gains in my supplier objective. So these are nice points because then I can kind of make this trade-off and maybe decide that I want to deploy this system in production. So up until now, I was just talking about a very, very naive setting, like two objectives. But what happens when we scale it out? The examples which we saw from Uber Eats and Airbnb, we had a list of objectives. So how do we adapt over there? So let me just give a quick motivation on how these objectives are interrelated. So I'm going to consider some user satisfaction objectives like clicks, stream time, the number of items you're consuming. I want to consider some supply diversity. And also let's say that the platform decides to boost some of the content on their platform. So if you look at it, then all these user satisfaction metrics are correlated with each other. That means like you optimize for one, you get the other for free, which is great because I don't have to be multi-objective. If I just focus on one of these, I'll get the others for free. But interestingly, the supply diversity is neutral, and some of these like boosting objectives, maybe they can hurt your satisfaction goals. So this is where we kind of highlight that it's not there's no free lunch. If you care about the other objectives, you'll have to make some of these trade-off and jointly optimize for some of these methods. So this is where we kind of come back to this question that how do we balance multiple objectives, not just two? So we had a paper at KDD last year, which is talking about these multi-objective bandits. So how do we view some of these optimization problems in a multi-objective setting? So I mentioned about the slide before, right? That we have multiple stakeholders. Let's come back with a multi-objective policy for recommendation. And the proposal we made in that paper is that let's use something called the generalized Gini function. So this Gini function is a form of an OWA, which is ordered weighted average. And one of the beautiful characteristics of this is that it preserves impartiality with respect to individual criteria. So again, I'm going to talk a bit more about this, but essentially what it means for us is that it prefers allocations that are equitable across objectives. So let me dive deeper over there. So this Gini function says that, hey, it's a weighted sum, but instead of just assigning a weight to each objective, I'm going to sort it first. So if you look at this, the line below the main function, there is a sorting operator applied over here. So essentially what it does is that I decide which weight to give to either the best performing or the worst performing objective. So again, this allows us a way to control the objective weights in a dynamic fashion. So maybe I'm doing really great on objective 1, so I don't need to kind of give more weight to it from now on, or maybe I'm really doing crap on objective 3 and I should kind of give more weight to it. So essentially, like I mentioned this, that the GGF function respects this pigeon delta transfer, that it prefers allocations that are more equitable. Let me give a quick example. So essentially, the pigeon delta transfer is like a decade-old principle, and it says that I'll have a gap diminishing transfer from someone with more to someone with less, and that will decrease the inequality. So if you look at 3 objectives, and if you look at the performance on these 3 objectives, so if I pick up slightly from the third objective and transfer it to the second objective, then what we're doing is we're transferring from something which has more to something which is less. And this would decrease the inequality we have across these objectives. So again, like if you look at this pigeon delta transfer, then it kind of, it can be viewed as a kindler, gentler cousin of the Pareto principle. So the Pareto principle prefers efficiency across your objectives, and the pigeon delta transfer prefers equity across some of these objectives. So again, it kind of, we can apply this on top of the functions we have, on top of the objectives we have. And essentially what that would mean for us is that, let's say we have j objectives, xi to xj, and then I'm going to transfer something, and xj is greater than xi. So that means like xj is kind of performing well and xi is not performing well. So I'm going to try to move something reduce something from ej and give it to my ith objective. So essentially, like you're transferring something from more to something with less. And the way we apply it in our setting is that we apply it to balance the reward vector. So again, like if you're in a bandit setting, then you can look at your reward vector, which is a multi-objective reward, and then you want to kind of focus on increasing the reward for your ith objective, wherein I hasn't been performing that well as an objective, perhaps. So again, like the GGF function gives us this measure of balance between the different objectives we care about. So with this background, let's see like how do we look at it from an implementation perspective. So again, this GGI function can be solved using a linear program, which is great. But the problem is that it's computationally very, very expensive for real-time deployment. So again, what we did was we devised a gradient-based solution to this. So essentially now we cast the recommendation problem as a multi-objective bandit problem. And essentially in the multi-objective bandit, we focus on this function itself. So I won't spend like whole 10 minutes, but again, this is a typical bandit scenario wherein you have to come up with the arm selection strategy, and then you observe some features because it's a contextual bandit model, and then you have a reward. Now, because it's a multi-objective problem, we have a vector of reward. We don't have a scalar reward. And now we can kind of design the optimal policy by maximizing this function. And this function is the Gini function, which we were just talking about. And the great benefit of a Gini, the GGF function, is that it prefers equitable allocation. So that means if my reward function is imbalanced, then it'll kind of force it to be a bit balanced across the different objectives. Great, and how does it perform? So let's say we only care about users. I don't care about other stakeholders. And in a just user-centric world, we see that if you optimize your model for multiple satisfaction metrics, then the multi-objective model performs better. So that means if you optimize for just interaction metrics, then a multi-objective interaction model is going to perform better than optimizing for each of these objectives. So again, this is a good takeaway that maybe even if I don't care about my other suppliers or platform, then also there is value in going multi-objective in our recommendation problem. If we add a competing objective like a business objective, then we see that we can get some gains in the business objective without hurting users. So this is a nice point. Like it need not be a zero-sum game. That maybe we can get gains in the supplier objective without hurting the users. So again, I think like the broader point which we are trying to make up until now is that we want to look at these multi-stakeholder platforms, and there's a bunch of them. A lot of these like billion-dollar companies now are essentially multi-stakeholder platforms. So here there is a need for multi-objective modeling. There's an interplay across objectives. If you look at a specific form of it, then the GGF function allows us to kind of model it in a multi-objective way and give us an allocation which is more equitable across objectives. And more importantly, from the insights perspective, is that, I mean, these are, your problem may not be a zero-sum problem, right? There could be gains for the users, for the other stakeholder platforms, if you're modeling it right. And I really want to zoom in on this like zero-sum game aspect in the second half of the talk as well. That how can I identify which users are okay with it, which type of content is okay with it? How can I come up with a world wherein when I try to do these multi-objective methods, then everybody, all the stakeholders feel happier and all their metrics kind of, all the boats rise up at once. So this is what we're kind of philosophically getting towards. Great. Just a quick recap. So we talked about these multi-stakeholder platforms. We talked about a couple of methods around how do we do this multi-objective methods. Now what I want to do is like, let's go broad. Let's kind of take a step back, look at it from a bird's eye view. That how should I be designing some of these industrial recommendation systems, which gives me the opportunity to support my suppliers, to support my users, to support my platform goals as well. So in this world, I'm going to briefly talk about 3 different lines of work. By no means is going to be an exhaustive coverage, but I just want to kind of give a flavor of how we are thinking about identifying these opportunities and leveraging them in our models essentially. So again, like it's going to be 3 papers, but just 1 or 2 slides on each without going into much detail. Yeah, so opportunity space. Where and for who can we shift consumption? So what is shifting consumption? I want to shift consumption which gives me the opportunity to kind of do well for my other stakeholder objectives. That's the main pitch we are trying to make here. So we had this paper at Rex's. It was a late-breaking paper, not a full paper. Just a short piece of work wherein we put in some thoughts on user receptivity. That how receptive are your users? Maybe some users are annoyed when you do this. Some users are okay with it. So this is the main point we wanted to understand. That perhaps different users are receptive to different extent. So let's say some users really care about like short-term satisfaction. They don't care about discovery. They don't care about diversity. And for those users, you have very less leeway. Whereas certain other users are a lot more receptive. So if you want to surface some of these other suppliers, other artists, then maybe those users are okay with you doing that. So in this work, we investigated this idea and said that maybe we can kind of quantify and predict user receptivity. That will a user be receptive to me doing these changes in their recommendations or not? So again, we kind of found evidence that user receptivity can be predicted, and there's a lot of variation. Some users are receptive, some users are not receptive. Just an example would be like some of these heavy use users, they often would want more diverse content, and diversity is a great thing because now I can show multiple different supplies to the user. And also we found evidence that receptivity is predictive of future engagement. So again, this is important because if you want to kind of push in some of these other goals on your platform for your suppliers or for the platform itself, and if the user doesn't really like it, then of course it makes sense that they're not going to be engaging further a lot. So again, we're finding evidence that just keep in mind that you should be kind of quantifying user receptivity and then targeting accordingly. So this gives us the motivation that let's have a user level personalization for objective targeting. Not all users are okay with it, and we should have a more nuanced user understanding to target accordingly. Okay, so this was user level, right? So quick recap, where are we? We're saying that I want to do multi-objectiveness in my platform, and I'm now identified that some users are okay, some users not. Let's ask the same question for content. So we had this paper at SICM industry track last year, wherein we are talking about query understanding. So if you look at some of these search queries, right? So some of these search queries are non-focused. So like relaxing music. So for a query like relaxing music, users are generally more open to non-specific recommendation. So this is very different than me saying that I want like Coldplay's this is specific song, right? Because there the user is very specific, they know what they want, but maybe there's a bunch of queries which are broad queries, which are like non-focused queries. And the way to look at these queries could be that these are opportunities to surface underserved content. So if there are artists which match well, users may not know about those artists. So it's a great way to facilitate discovery on your platform as well. So we did a few A/B tests wherein we try to kind of train our ranking models in a way which kind of incorporates some of these nuances. And then we found evidence that, again, there's a trade-off here, that you can give exposure gains to some of these underserved artists, but there's a trade-off. So there are some methods wherein like you will lose out on satisfaction. There are some methods wherein you won't lose out on satisfaction. Again, there's a trade-off world which exists, but more importantly, this kind of creates this new space of problems for us that I should do content level personalization for objective targeting. That maybe there are enough heterogeneity in the content users is asking for. Maybe there are like Discover Weekly as a playlist, right? So Discover Weekly is about discovery. I mean, like we have to develop models which predict which type of discoveries would user love and which kind of discoveries user won't love. But discovery is a way for me to add audience to an artist. That if a new user can discover a new artist, that's great. Like the artist will get a new fan, the user will get a new artist. So it's a great matching made in heaven for us. So this is what we want to do. We want to kind of identify content which allows us to kind of get these gains on some of these other objectives. And finally, like you can look at some of these recommendation characteristics. So we looked at user characteristics, we looked at content characteristics. And in third, I want to talk about like some of these recommendation characteristics. So diversity is one of them. And we had this paper at Wisdom earlier this year, wherein we were talking about how do we look at diversity to shift consumption. So again, the viewpoint we try to make over there is that we should look at diversity as an enabler for shifting consumption. So shifting consumption towards less popular content. Why? because we want all suppliers to get exposure, right? And also like shifting consumption to content which differs from users' historic taste. Because again, staleness of recommendation is a big problem. Like, I mean, I don't come to Spotify or Netflix even for like watching the same set of movies or watching the same set of music or podcasts. I mean, I want to discover new content, right? So again, we have inherent motive to kind of shift consumption towards less popular content and kind of expand the user's taste profile as such as well. So in this paper, we kind of said that, okay, like let's model this problem in a diversity encouragement fashion. And what we did was we formulated the recommendation problem in the reinforcement learning setting. And here we said that let's look at it from a track sampling problem, that a user comes in, they're in this playlist or they're on radio, and I want to show a sequence of music tracks. So now I want to sample one track at a time and then start showing that to the user. So what we did was we devised this end-to-end architecture. Again, I'm going to skip the details. That's not the main point. Just a quick summary is that we have some of these dynamic user embeddings. We look at some feedback models and then try to kind of devise this like sampling procedure. Now tell me which track should I pick up from the current pool based on the goals we have. And this is where like, because you have an RL or a bandit setting, then you can do a lot with the reward formulation. So again, if you try to bring in diversity aspects into your reward models, then the model is gonna try to pick up content which is not only about short-term satisfaction, but also kind of gives you some benefits to the diversity or some other tail artists, tail suppliers as well. And again, there's a lot of results in the paper, but I think the main point we wanted to convey is in this plot. So on the x-axis, we have this popularity diversity. So again, like if things are on the right, that means a lot of tail suppliers are getting exposed. So here we say that the red model only cares about user satisfaction. The blue model cares about the RL model, which is let's diversify as well. So we are able to shift consumption towards the right. So there are a lot more sessions wherein people are consuming content from tail suppliers as well. So that's the takeaway from the second part, right? Which is that we're looking at understanding user receptivity can help us inform these objective matching. Understanding a content gives us that way. Looking at diversity as an enabler for shifting consumption gives us a good way to look at this problem. Sorry, how much time do we have remaining? If somebody can mention, I can adjust accordingly. Maybe we're in time. I'm just gonna quickly mention 2 or 3 things on broader questions and then end. So I think like we still are a long way through from quantifying supplier objectives. So what objectives should we be looking at per user or global? There are interaction effects across these objectives. There's a world of trade-off which we should look at and understand more. Evaluation time frame is important, like just short-term or long-term, and even like per session or across sessions. Attribution, why are we screwing up? Why are the users unhappy? Is it because of this objective or that objective? And evaluation, like in a multi-metric setting, I think like the previous talk was talking about how do we make these ship decisions across a few trade-off decisioning, which is great problems which we have to uncover. Counterfactual evaluation, going beyond single metrics is a huge pain which we have to come across. And also like supplier side A/B testing, like how do we accommodate for spillover effects when we want to consider these, oh, we have 10 minutes left. Okay, sorry, I rushed through. So again, like, I think like one of the broader points which I want to make over here is this multi-metric decisioning. So in the previous talk as well, I think we were talking about when we are making these ship decisions, then what are the trade-offs? So here, the interesting part over here is that should we be focusing on just users, or am I okay with like a 0.5% drop in user satisfaction for a 5% gain in some of these artist metrics? Or am I okay with like short-term user satisfaction and long-term user satisfaction? So a quick example over here would be discovery. So, I mean, users love to discover content, but they may not always like discovery content because you might skip more, right? I mean, if you see a new track, you may not stream it immediately. You'll kind of skip a lot, and skipping increases some of these dissatisfaction objectives as well. So this is the main point, that when you're trying to make, in an industrial setting, when you're trying to make a decision that should I ship this new model or not, So now what we have to deal with is we have to have a look at like 6 different objectives. Look at the trade-off, like how much gain are we getting in one objective versus how much trade-off, how much are we losing on the other objective? And is that trade-off okay with us or is that not? Now imagine like in an industry, there are 6 teams developing 6 different models and they all come together on the homepage or on your recommendation surface. So how do you do offline evaluation? How do you develop your models when there's another change which team C can do, which is gonna destroy my trade-off, right? So these are very, very nuanced problems, not just in model development, but also coordination across teams. And this is where this platform governance comes into play. That as a platform, like the system owners get to design and decide that what kind of trade-offs do I want my platform to be about? So do I want it to be about more discoveries, less familiarity, like Discover Weekly? So Discover Weekly is not about short-term satisfaction. It is about like discovering content. Or do I want something more about like Release Radar? So Release Radar is a playlist which is about showing new and upcoming emerging artists, right? So now you're seeing that different recommendation surfaces care about different objectives in different ways, which is great because I want these system owners to specify that what is your surface about, and then they can design these platform governance rules that, okay, I'm not going to trade off discovery objective over here, but in the other surface, I'm okay if you get a hit in discovery if you're trying to promote some of these artists. So again, there's a world of multi-metric decisioning which we have to think about. Again, like because it's a multi-metric world, so counterfactual evaluation and all those randomization things which companies, including Netflix, including a lot of like eBay and a bunch of other companies do, again, we have to scale it out. I have to have these unbiased estimators, not only on one metric, but now I have to deal with it in a multi-metric setting. We've had a couple of papers on this topic recently, one at KDD last year as well, if you're interested. And finally, like supply side A/B test. It's very easy for us to, I mean, it's not easy, but a lot of the community has done work around A/B testing on the user side. But what if I want to start A/B testing on the supply side? Like spillover effects happen. It's easy to divide your traffic into A and B, treatment and control, on the user side, but like you can't stop some suppliers to get shown to some users. So there's a lot more nuanced around how do we design these supply side A/B tests as well over here. Again, I just want to shout out to a paper from Facebook Marketplace at SIGIR last year, which is talking about some of these problems and how they're looking into this. Again, okay, so this was rushed, but I hope you got a main takeaway points. If you're interested, we had a KDD tutorial last year on this problem, like how do we look at multi-stakeholder marketplaces, and some of the references are over here. So just a quick summary, we have looked at the main goal of multi-stakeholder problems. We have looked at a few approaches on how do we look at multi-objective methods, how do we understand user receptivity, how do we understand queries, and all of this to kind of come up with a world and come up with a model which does some of these objective balancing at scale. And if you want just one slide pictorial takeaway, then this is it. So looking at an industrial system, there's multiple components which have to come together, and we have to design our ecosystem in a way which supports all these objectives and all these stakeholders. So there's users, and we care about some user aspects. There are suppliers, we care about supplier aspects. There's a platform, we care about the long-term goal of the platforms. They all should feed into your algorithmic balancing decisions. And you have adaptivity, you have some measurement on the objectives, you have some feedback, and then you kind of show your recommendations on your platform. So again, rather than looking at it from a one single model perspective, now I think like I'm hoping that some of you who are not in the industry could start thinking about these industrial recommender systems as an ecosystem. That is not about just one model. There are like multiple teams here developing multiple models, and they're interacting with each other, and then all of this goes into deciding what recommendations we show to the user on the homepage or on any recommendation surface. So with that, I think that's it. We'll have time for a few questions. And again, the KDD tutorial slides are online, and I'm on Twitter and happy to answer questions now.
Okay, thank you, Rishabh, for your interesting presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? 5 minutes, so I think we may have 2 questions. I see there's a hand raised, so please go ahead. Go ahead, Molly.
Thanks for the great talk. So I have a question regarding, it's not a question, but I mean, kind of, what is your recommendation or comment? Like, sometimes in terms of like platform objectives, you might want to favor smaller creators,
Right.
but then, the most of the revenue, like you see, is driven by the popular creators.
Right.
So how do you decide in terms of the trade-off? Because like you have more revenue from
Right.
overall, then those smaller creators can also benefit from that financial windfall kind of.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Mo. This is a great point, right? And this is the dilemma which all of us live in, right? That I mean, most of these recommendations and search systems are like heavy head, that like few creators and few search queries make up 70% of our traffic. But I think like one of the things which a lot of these systems are now getting good at is exploiting the niche tail. That there's a lot. I mean, if you look at TikTok, there's a lot of followers for a very specific type of videos. So again, these are not like these are not one of the greatest and most popular creators, but then they care about this niche content which will find audience in the right way. So again, when you're looking at like 300 million users or 500 million users, then I think if the recommender systems is doing a good job at finding out from this like huge mass of 500 million users who are the people who will be most interested in this niche content, then I think like suddenly there's a world in which we can give more exposure to some of those suppliers. Now, should it be a trade-off? Should I have to kind of take away from some of these popular suppliers and then give it? It need not be. So this is where I think like one of the goals of the system could be expand the pie, right? So can we increase consumption? Can we kind of make users to kind of consume more? So if users are consuming more, if they're retaining on your platform more, or if they're kind of abandoning your sessions less, so then there is surplus. And then we can distribute that surplus to other stakeholders. So I think this is a very nice angle to investigate, right? That when you're looking at an ecosystem, is it really like a zero-sum game? Or can I increase the pie of consumption and then distribute my surplus? So I think there are some ways in which we can philosophically think about it and then come back with some modeling approaches of matching the niche creators with the appropriate content, and users start kind of consume more, and then we're not kind of stealing from one and giving to the other. So there's like a gain overall across all type of creators, perhaps. Just worth mentioning. Like I think like Mohit, you've raised an excellent point. It's easy for us to say that let's do that, but these are some really non-trivial problems which you have to address to get there.
Right. Thanks.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Rishabh. Thanks for the great talk. I just had a question regarding user receptivity, which you had mentioned in your talk.
Right.
So you basically said that, okay, we'd like to shift content, like shift users towards content that's probably less popular, or towards artists that are less known.
Right.
Or, shift users away from their past history or something that we're used to listening to. So I was just thinking, isn't user receptivity depend a lot on mood? So,
yeah.
For example, on one particular day, I could just be like,
right.
I just want to listen to my favorite playlist or all these particular artists. Another day, I could just be like, oh, I really want to discover these unknown artists. Or,
right.
I have a really good feeling for discovering something
yes.
new.
Yes.
So how do you, what are the sort of metrics and how do you balance between, because you can't assign a user to being
right.
receptive or not receptive.
Right.
Whole, right?
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. This is an excellent point, Tejas. I think one of the things which I've conveniently missed for a 30-minute talk is user intent, right? So I mean, user intent is something which governs everything. So I think when you look at user receptivity, then we're talking about two broad things. One is that user receptivity overall, and then like what's the user's specific need right now. So user receptivity is a very high-level abstract phrase or abstract notion. User intent is a lot more like temporal and context-driven. That right now I'm commuting. I don't care about music. I'm going to listen to my podcast because I'm commuting for the next half an hour. So again, like I think some of these intent-aware models kind of will prioritize local decisions accordingly. So understanding the user intent and then exploiting that intent is something which is ideally happening here. It's just that like I didn't get the time to kind of talk about it. But this is also where you cannot assign users, right? You cannot assign users to kind of, hey, these are the users I'm going to focus on diversity. No, I think it's about understanding users' current needs. So there's like a global need for user, like globally users, this user loves familiar music. This users love to discover more content. And from that, you can use that to inform some of your local decisions that, okay, generally this user loves discovery, but right now they're into music, they're kind of having a house party. So they may they may just favor their known artists and known tracks, right? So I think that global understanding about users should inform the local understanding, and that local understanding should go into the model, and we should make decisions accordingly. So that's a great point. Like understanding user intent is imperative. Otherwise, like we'll kind of fail over here.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
That's great. Thank you, Rishabh. If we don't have more questions, then we can go